Okay, everybody. So we're gathered back together. It's been a little while since we've been together. Very happy that we had the opportunity to get back together today. And so where I feel like we're headed, what we want to cover next is into the books of First and Second Corinthians. I want us to look at those together. Obviously, we're going sort of chronologically through the New Testament era, the book of Acts, and the epistles and so forth that are written in the New Testament, and how they fit in together and fit in with the book of Acts, and give some context to those writings, as well as just pull out what the Word of God has for us in those writings. So just as actually, I'm sorry, give me 1 second here. With the books of Corinthians, it's kind of interesting because you may likely be aware that there's a First Corinthians in the Bible and there's a Second Corinthians in the Bible. Excuse me. There are indications in those letters. It's kind of interesting to really look at what they have connecting to what goes on in the book of Acts, because there are phrases and things in First and Second Corinthians that kind of point to the things that we read about in the book of Acts, and point to sort of filling in some blanks and things in between some of what we see in the book of Acts. But in particular, each one of them also has some language that may be pointing to additional letters written to the Corinthians. So some people theorize that Paul wrote at least 4 different epistles to the Corinthians, and that First Corinthians is actually the second one, and Second Corinthians is actually the 4th one. But then there are other ways to maybe interpret what those things have to say. It could be that these are the only letters. Of course, who knows? Maybe he wrote 50 letters to the Corinthians. We don't know. But what we put our confidence in, I put my confidence in, is that the Bible that God has provided is what he wanted me to have. And that what was written in these two are the things that the Lord wanted preserved as scripture. So it doesn't really ultimately matter for you and me whether Paul wrote more letters or not, and whether those phrases allude to these others or not. But it is kind of just interesting to think about. So we're going to kind of dig into both letters in a little bit of detail, but not a lot of detail today. Let me give us just a little bit of context today. This is just to remind us of where a lot of Paul's ministry took place. So on the right-hand side to the east on this map, you've got the region of Asia. And then on the left upper side, northwest, we've got the region of Macedonia. And then in the northeast, we've got the region of Achaia.
Yeah, are you trying to show us the map? I don't think we've got it.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me do that. There we go. There you go. Now you can see the map. Yeah, so we've got Asia on the right, Macedonia and Achaia on the left. And personally, when I really put, it was a long time for me personally in reading the Bible before I really put together what these regions were and where they were. Once that really clicked for me, which cities are in which regions, there's a lot of things reading the Bible that it helped me follow in just reading the New Testament, reading the epistles. And so like Athens, I think of in our modern day, Athens as, and even if I think over what I've, history or whatever, it seems to me that Athens is a bigger deal than Corinth, right? Maybe you feel the same way, maybe you don't, but actually at that time, Corinth was a more significant city in the Roman Empire at that time than Athens. So when Paul talks about Achaia, he's talking about Corinth and surrounding areas. It's not limited to Corinth, but it's almost interchangeable language. So, and when Paul talks about Asia, he's talking about Ephesus, and vice versa. If he talks about Ephesus, he's talking about Asia as a region, Ephesus being the most significant city and where the ministry there grew. So if you remember, in the second missionary journey, when Paul first came to these regions, he passed right through Asia, coming from Galatia, which is farther to the east there, and went to Troas, crossed the water to Philippi, started churches there. And we have the Philippians, traveled to Thessalonica, and we have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, then to Berea, which I tend to feel like the letters to the Thessalonians kind of go along with the Bereans and were targeted to that whole region. I might be wrong about that. We don't have any letter to the Bereans. Then he came down to Athens, where we do get a story in the book of Acts, but we don't really get an indication that a church really got started there. But instead, a couple of converts actually left Athens with him, and then Corinth began a massive revival there. Later, he went over to Ephesus, and just then back on the third missionary journey, really got things started at Ephesus and Asia, and revisited all these places and traveled a little bit of back and forth between Macedonia and Achaia. So Corinth at this time is like I say, a very significant city. It's a thriving city. And it's a city characterized by a lot of paganism and a lot of immorality. And it's not like some of the cities that where the Jewish presence is heavily influential in the culture, where the Jewish sensibility and morality is noticeable in the general culture. There is a Jewish presence here, but reportedly, from what we gather historically, the general culture of Corinth was very ungodly. But God still raised up a great church. But it does give some insight into the things that Paul addresses in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Now, also relevant to the map is the fact that Paul wrote both of these letters from the city of Ephesus. And while he's there writing, he talks about his intentions to travel back to Corinth. He talks about planning to probably go to Macedonia and then to Corinth, or to Corinth and then to Macedonia, and that kind of thing. And he talks about his companion ministers, such as Titus and Timothy, and them doing some traveling around. And so what we kind of get the realization is that while he's traveling among these areas, trying to keep things going strong, he's also has his helpers like Timothy and like Sosthenes and Silas and Titus, who are doing some traveling. Sometimes they're with Paul, sometimes they're traveling away from Paul, so that they kind of have somebody in almost everywhere, almost all the time. You may have some experience in your business that you can relate to needing to do that sort of thing. So, and we also hear him talk about Apollos, who we studied specifically. Apollos, we gather from the writings, doesn't really serve as much of an assistant to Paul as some of the others do, but almost more of a peer and a leader in the same caliber with Paul to the churches there. But he travels around and has spent some time with Paul at Ephesus and also at Corinth. Now, the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians are really long in New Testament terminology. The longest epistles are Romans and 1st Corinthians at 16 chapters each. And then 2nd Corinthians also has 13 chapters. So these two books together, letters to the Corinthians, it's a lot to read. And they cover a lot of really similar content, what's in First Corinthians and what's in Second Corinthians. There's some things that are unique to each, but then there's some things where they sort of overlap with each other and have some similarity. But the most, he deals with a lot of addressing immorality and addressing staying pure and overcoming temptation and these kinds of things, some really valuable stuff. And he also, so it's kind of interesting, the Corinthian church seems to, perhaps by the writings that we see, maybe have to deal with more influence in terms of immorality and paganism than some of the other areas, which indicates just the nature of where they are and the culture that they're among. But what they also seem to have that is a sort of unique by comparison to other churches is there's a lot of supernatural power experienced by the people. Now, there's a supernatural power experienced in all the places where Paul ministered, but it seems like the Corinthian church kind of stood out in terms of how much the people there operated in the Spirit and ministered supernaturally in the Spirit. And so a very important portion of First Corinthians, 3 chapters long, going from chapter 12 through chapter 14, is addressing, bringing those things, making sure these things are operating appropriately and in the right order and not getting out of order with operating in the gifts of the Spirit. Fascinating stuff to read. And right in the middle of that, though, is chapter 13. Chapter 12 is pretty long. Chapter 14 is pretty long. And we get a lot of teaching about how gifts of the Spirit work and how to appropriately operate in gifts of the Spirit. When I say gifts of the Spirit, I'm talking about things like prophecy, healing, and other miracles, words of wisdom, words of knowledge, speaking into somebody's life, things that you wouldn't have known to say if the Lord had not laid it into your mind and spirit. And those kinds of things can bring deliverance to people's life. When you're able to speak something from the Lord, it comes with power. You know, the Bible says that his word does not return void. If the Lord puts a word, it comes with power and it makes an impact. And then also, as I say, healings, laying on of hands, miraculous recoveries, instantaneous or otherwise. These are what the Bible calls gifts of the Spirit that are given for ministry purposes, and they should be in the church. And the Corinthian church was in great condition in that they do have these things operating, but almost too much. You know, you say, well, how could you have too much of the miraculous? Well, it's just that there does need to also be order. And so that's what's being addressed in 12, 13, and 14. And like I say, 12 and 14 are pretty long. Then right in the middle of it, you have chapter 13, which is a lot shorter. Of course, Paul didn't put the chapter divisions. That's how the translators and organizers chose to put the divisions, but it's neat to focus in on this shorter portion of the we call 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul, in the heart of teaching about gifts of the Spirit, brings the focus into love. And really like us to deal with this because it connects to what we've been doing. We've been emphasizing the power of the Spirit as opposed to the power of the flesh, right? And we talked a little bit about, I know it's been several weeks, but we talked some about how that really the ultimate manifestation of the Spirit in my life and your life is pure love, because God is love. And so if God's Spirit is working in me and through me, that converts all of my carnal attitudes into the pure love of God. And that's really, like I say, the ultimate manifestation of God in me is if I am a loving person. And so that's what I really want to keep an eye on myself about, as somewhat of a thermometer to check my condition, my spiritual condition. If I find myself not operating in love, that's a more important indicator. You know, the Spirit also brings power over sin, right? The Spirit working in your life brings righteousness to your life. And also the Spirit brings power of ministry, supernatural power. It brings that. But both of those things are less of a priority than love. Okay, they need to be there, but love is the ultimate. So I just want us to just look today at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So let me put it on the screen here. So as I said, he's been teaching about gifts of the Spirit, prophecies, one version of prophecy that he refers to as tongues with interpretation and these kinds of things. So he says, okay, so yeah, we're talking about these gifts of the Spirit. We want these gifts of the Spirit. We want you to operate them with them in the right way. But let's take a moment. Verse 1, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal, which amounts to nothing. Verse 2, though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. I should have said before I started to read this, I've been using the word love, and 1 Corinthians uses the word charity. It's a Greek word that is translated sometimes as love, but the translators for this version of the Bible, in most versions, it uses the word love. In this version, King James, they chose the word charity for it to stand out as opposed to several other Greek words that also translate into English as love. I wanted to draw attention to what brand of love we're talking about here, and that is the brand that is the pureness of God, where we care more about others than we do ourselves. So charity and love are interchangeable here. Now, notice the things he's talking about. He's talking about things that if we were aware of a person with these attributes, gift of prophecy, understanding all mysteries and knowledge, faith, moving mountains, we would be like, wow, that person is such an incredible man of God or woman of God. You know, we would be in awe. And the Apostle Paul is saying these things aren't worth anything if love is not present. Verse 3, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. And let's notice this. The giving all of my goods to feed the poor, Paul is pointing out that even that act of apparent generosity could be done in the absence of love. In other words, like, well, why would you give to someone? Well, out of love, right? Maybe, but you can actually be giving and it's an appearance, but it may not really, you may not really have charity. Sometimes people give to make themselves feel better. Sometimes people give to make themselves look better in others' eyes. And it's not necessarily out of charity. And so Paul's saying, yeah, well, it's not going to do you much good, the giving. It doesn't profit you. It may still profit them, right? So you give to whomever to meet whatever need. Well, you've profited them, but you're not profiting yourself if you're not doing it with the right motives. But if you have love and you're giving out of love, then that sets up a cycle, a chain reaction that as I bless others, it draws in the blessings of God onto me, but only if it's done with charity. Now, here's where he defines what charity is. And I said a moment ago that I try to check myself and just really feel, tune into where my thinking is, what my actions are. And this right here is the yardstick. This is what I'm comparing my thoughts and attitudes and choices with when I'm trying to check where am I at with the Lord. Charity suffereth long, so being patient with people. That's pretty tough sometimes, especially driving the car and other people on the road, maybe not being of the same mind that I am all the time. And is kind. And one of the things about being kind to others that's worth noting is it seems like it's a lot easier sometimes to be kind to strangers than it is to be kind to the people close to us. And if we are loving, we need to love those that are close to us. All of these things should be thought about in the context of dealing with strangers, dealing with relatively close acquaintances, dealing with very close family. Think of the different dimensions of relationship and interaction that if you may have with different people. All of these things should be manifested in all of these relationships. Kind, envieth not. When someone's doing well or receiving something, love rejoices with that person instead of being frustrated that it's not happening to me. Charity vaunteth not itself and is not puffed up. Those two things kind of go together. Not trying to put myself over somebody else or get recognition or think of myself, as the Bible says, more highly than I ought to think. These things can't be faked, you guys. You can act the part for these things, but if you're checking yourself, you can't fake not envying. You know what I mean? And you can't fake not being puffed up. So we've got to be honest with ourselves. And the great news is, as we recognize ourselves coming short in any of these areas, God can and will and does help. And the recognition, if we see ourselves short in these areas, it's to drive us to prayer and to drive us to connect to the Lord. And he does transform us into these things. Okay, verse 5 says, does not behave itself unseemly. Just behaving in a way that just causes a scene and makes people go, what's going on over there, right? It's not that you can't be exuberant, but there's an unseemly behavior that just, that we can get pulled into, that everybody else is going, hey, what's wrong with you right now? But if you get in that mode, you can just not see it in yourself if you're not careful. Seeketh not her own, but seeks the benefit of others more than yourself. A lot of us have learned that if we do that and seek others' benefit, we end up benefiting. But if we seek our own benefit more than others, we limit ourselves. And that's right here in the Bible. That's a manifestation of love. You might not do it truly out of love, but it is a manifestation of love. Is not easily provoked. I like the fact that it doesn't say cannot be provoked. It gives us a little bit of leeway, but not easily provoked. Like I can handle some things not going my way, and I can handle somebody not treating me the way that I feel like they ought to, at least a bit. It's not easily provoked. Thinketh no evil. So what I believe this is talking about is how we interpret what's going on with others and our interactions with others. You've probably been around long enough and been in enough situations to realize that sometimes when I'm in an interaction, I'm perceiving the situation very differently than they are. And the interaction very differently, which means there's really a variety of ways to take things, and there's a variety of ways to interpret things. So as long as there are choices to in terms of like trying to recognize what someone else's motives are, what they're trying to do or whatever, as long as there are different possibilities, how about I just assume the best? You know, maybe it is the very best possible thing. So let me just assume that rather than assuming the worst, because I might be wrong. I'd rather be wrong thinking the best. Maybe I would be wrong, but I'd rather be wrong thinking the best than thinking the worst. So just don't even think that of the evil possibilities of what's going on. Rejoices not in iniquity, not happy if somebody does have a problem. You know, sometimes there can be a carnal reaction to finding out there was a problem because, okay, yeah, I knew it or whatever. But no, our heart should break if someone has a problem and we happen to come to that knowledge. Our heart should break for that person and pray for that person. But rejoices in the truth. Truth is always right and to be celebrated, whether it's good news or bad news. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. These I wanted to just not do one at a time, but these go together. That pure God-given love, God-generated charity gets through everything and can continue. Now, when it says believes all things, don't misinterpret that. Doesn't mean that someone tells you something and you just believe it no matter what. You know, you can use good sense and you can use good wisdom and you can recognize when somebody was lying. But you can still believe in that person and believe in their potential and believe that they can make it and that they can do better than that. And believe for a positive outcome. One of the verses in 1 Corinthians that we're not reading today, actually it might be 2 Corinthians, I think it's 2 Corinthians, but anyway, says don't judge anything before the time. And we may deal with that in a little bit more detail in a later week, but what it's saying is don't just draw a final conclusion on somebody at a snapshot of a moment in their life, because God is working on all of us. And even if there's a problem, God is in a process, and this person may come out to a full victory before it's all over with. So don't write them off. Continue to believe in people, even if you can recognize, not saying to put blinders on, but just you may recognize issues, but believe in the potential and in the hope of overcoming, and maintain that love and that attitude that is in favor of others' success. And then the last attribute that it describes in this list is that charity never fails. Now that I put that ellipsis there because that verse continues on to say some other things. And we'll read well, you know what? I don't even want to read the rest of the chapter. It's just a few verses, but it sort of goes a little bit in a different direction. And that's just what I wanted us to do today, is just absorb these characteristics of what the love of God looks like and manifests as, and just urge us to crave these things and to reach for these things and pray for these things and to check ourselves and acknowledge when we're coming short in these areas and turn to God to make us better.